So in this video, we're going to look at the structures of the heart, its makeup, and the vessels associated with bringing blood to the heart itself. So the heart's divided up into four chambers. There's two atria, they're the upper chambers, and then the two ventricles are the lower chambers. The atria, as it says here, are thin-walled. This is like a little, if you've ever been to like Disney World, I guess, or whatever, this is the entryway before you get on the roller coaster ride. The atrium are these two that the blood comes back into, just kind of like a little opening, and it just kind of waits until it gets into the main room, which is the ventricles. The ventricles are the thick walled muscular pumps, and so they are the ones that are doing all of the heavy lifting in the heart. And so there are these little things called auricles. Hopefully you remember this, or it should ring a little bell in your memory, because that is what the name of the outer part of the ear was, an auricle or a pinna, and that's what they are. Because the atrium are these little thin-walled upper chambers, when we start exercising or needing to increase what we'll call our stroke volume, the amount of blood that's moving through, sometimes I need a little overflow pouch, and that's what they are. They're associated with the atrium. So when the atrium gets too full, if I have more that it needs to go because the atrium are so thin, they go into these little flap-like projections on the atria, and they allow for extra volume of blood in that area. But we'll look at those kind of in lab. But these are the two main ones: the atrium or atria and the ventricles. So the heart's divided up and again, remember, everything's kind of mirror image. So when we're looking at something like the heart, we're kind of looking at it from looking at the opposite way from someone standing looking at us. So right over here, left over on this side. The right, and I wish, and I don't feel, I wish I could change the color of this marker, and I don't know exactly how to do it, but the blood coming back to the right atrium is deoxygenated blood that's been used by the body. All right. The blood coming back to the left atrium is oxygen-rich blood coming back from the lungs. As the right atrium, as it says here, receives blood returning from the systemic circuit, that's deoxygenated blood, and it's going to move through the right atrium into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, when it squeezes, the blood is going to be pumped into the lungs to get recharged. So then the blood goes to the lungs. It is going to drop off the carbon dioxide, and it's going to pick up the oxygen. And then it's going to move to the left atrium. That's a bad O2. From the left atrium, it's going to go to the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle pumps it out to the body, and that's what we call the systemic circuit. The body uses the oxygen that it's delivering, and so it returns back to the right atrium as deoxygenated blood, and that's basically the pattern of how the heart works. So it's kind of divided up. We're going to look at how this works a couple different ways, so don't get too attached to this. But we'll divide it up here looking at the right side versus the left side. Deoxygenated blood comes in the right atrium, goes to the right ventricle, is squeezed out to the lungs. The oxygenated blood goes to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and squeezed out to the... So this is a little, excuse me, a little picture of the heart showing the chambers. And you'll see this one, they cut off a little part here on this one so that you can see a certain valve, and we'll look at it in a second on that one up top. But just to look at this, I've got this represents, this little opening here represents the right atrium. The one right here is going to represent the right ventricle. When it squeezes, it's going to move through this valve that we'll talk about in just a second and go on its way to the lungs. This is called the pulmonary trunk. You'll need to know that. As it leaves, it's going to branch right and left. And actually, because this is mirror image, this is the left part. So this is the left pulmonary artery. Now remember, even though it is blue, it is an artery because the blood is being pumped away from the heart. And so this over here is the right pulmonary artery, because in the pulmonary circuit, arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood, veins are carrying oxygenated blood. So the blood goes to the lungs. It's going to come back by way of pulmonary veins. Here, this is the left pulmonary veins, and you can see that they are red. And these are the right pulmonary veins. They are bringing blood back into this one. You can only see a little bit because of the pulmonary trunks over it. But this is the left atrium. From the left atrium, the blood goes down into the left ventricle. The left ventricle squeezes, and the blood's going to go up. And again, you can't see it here. If we go up top to the picture here, you can see going into what we call the aorta. This is another valve we'll look at here shortly. And then from the aorta, it's going to go around to the body, and then it gets used, and it's going to come back by way of either the superior vena cava for the used blood that's above the heart, or the inferior vena cava down here for the deoxygenated blood that is from the lower part of the body. And they go to the right atrium. And so that whole cycle starts all over again. Now I'm going to erase my chicken scratch here, and I'm going to show a few little things while we've got this picture out. Now, one of the things I want to show that isn't anything, I'll talk about it later. This is a really interesting structure. I'm just kind of bringing it up. I'm not going to test you on it. When a baby is in the mother's womb, this is actually a vessel. Since the lungs aren't developed and don't work, we don't want to pump blood into the lungs. So we have this little shunt to make sure that if any blood gets in the pulmonary circuit, it gets back into the aorta. And as soon as the baby is born, this shuts down and turns into a ligament. It's pretty cool the way it works, and we'll talk about that at a later time. But what I want to talk about now is, again, we've got the four chambers, the left and right atrium, and the left and right ventricles. Now, the way that this works is there are one-way doors in each of the ventricles. I've got two one-way doors. One comes in and one goes out. So if I have a little drawing of a room here, wow, why did it stick like that? Let's say I have a door here, and this is the exit. This door only swings out. And so I've got a door here, which is the entrance, and it only swings in. This is how a pump works. When it squeezes and I put pressure on this room, if the walls close in, this door is going to try to be pushed back, and it's going to want to fling out, but we're going to have little structures that are going to keep it from doing that. And so if you look over here, this is called the tricuspid valve. And then on this side, we have the bicuspid or mitral valve. All right, so we have these little valves that are between the atrium and the ventricle, and they're called AV valves, atrioventricular valves. And so again, this side's called the tricuspid because it's going to have three teeth-like flaps. Cuspids are what we look at. They're the little canine teeth kind of besides our incisors. And the bicuspid only has two. And there's two structures that help keep these from being blown back into the atrium. The structures are, first, a muscle that comes off the wall of the ventricle called the papillary muscle. And if you remember in 210, we looked at the dermal papillae and the hair papillae, and hopefully you were told that papillae means finger-like. So these papillary muscles are finger-like muscles that extend out from the walls of the ventricle. So they're called papillary muscles. And attached to them are these cord-like tendons. It almost looks like these things are kite surfing if you look at them really closely. All right, these cord-like tendons are called chordae tendineae. Now, this is kind of funny. I always laugh at this. I have since I was a student. If you've ever noticed, if you ever have gone somewhere that doesn't speak your normal language and you don't know the language, you try to put an accent of whatever it is and speak your language. So, for instance, if I as someone from America that speaks American English, if I went to France and don't know how to speak French, which I don't, and I'm trying to get, do you know how to go to the hotel? And to me, whenever I hear chordae tendineae, it sounds like someone trying to put a Greek or a Latin accent on just cord-like tendons. So anyway, I always just think that's funny. So these AV valves, the right side is called the tricuspid, the left side is called the bicuspid or mitral. They are kept from being blown back into the atrium by way of these finger-like muscles called papillary muscles and these cord-like tendons called chordae tendineae. The reason that most people probably, if I was going to label a couple of these valves, if I said the word mitral valve, most people have heard of it because the left side is under the most pressure. And so the most pressure of all four of the valves is on the mitral valve. And so it has a tendency to have murmurs or regurgitation to it. And that's a problem. And you can kind of see if you look at the two ventricles, this left ventricle is much smaller than the right because the left side has to squeeze harder. Now we're going to learn that the volume that's ejected from both of them has to be the same since it's a circuit, but we need stronger muscles here on the left side. So those are the AV valves, the tricuspid valve versus the mitral valve, or sometimes called the bicuspid. Now we have two other valves, and these are the exit doors, and they are called semilunar valves because they're made up of three little bags, basically, three little pockets that kind of look like this, and then there would be another one over here in front. And so let's say I've drawn them on this side here. When blood goes through this way, what ends up happening is the valve kind of gets pushed off to the side and lets the blood flow through. But when the blood tries to come back, the blood gets caught by these little pockets, and it causes the pockets to expand and block off the entryway. So you can see this is the pulmonary valve because the pulmonary valve is on the pulmonary trunk. And then the aortic valve, which is this one here. That was a bad circle on there. I don't know what happened. Is this one right here, and that's why the pulmonary trunk on this picture has been cut off so you can see it. It's under here. And so this is called the aortic valve. So the four valves are listed on the next slide. The tricuspid is on the right side. It's the right valve between the atrium and the ventricle, so it's called the atrioventricular valve. And it keeps blood from going back into the right atrium. If I go down here, the mitral or bicuspid valve is on the left side. It is also an AV or atrioventricular valve. It keeps blood from going back into the left atrium. Then we have the exit doors. On the right side, we have pulmonary valve that is going out to the pulmonary circuit, and then the aortic valve going out to the aorta. So I hope that makes sense. This is one of the things where I feel that if we were all together and I could explain it, it would be easier to understand. But I hope that you've got that. I'm going to go over it again in the lab video for week 2, and hopefully be able to see a little bit with that. So this is the look of the valves. These are like I say, the ones here, 1 and 2 that I put here. Those are the semilunar valves, and you can kind of see how they're these little pockets. And again, when the blood is going up through them, these pockets get pushed off to the side, and it allows for blood to get through. It goes this, like this. But once the blood tries to go back, these balloon up, and the more pressure you put on them, the more solid the seal is. Now this up here, it says on the top left, this is the tricuspid, and you can kind of see it's here, here, and here. The top right is the mitral or bicuspid valve. And this here, as you can see on this side, these are the papillary muscles, and then the cord-like tendons called chordae tendineae that attach to the valves on that. Another picture, and I can't go back as the way this goes, but if you go back to that picture we just looked at, you will see this little part, which is the opening of the coronary artery that we're going to talk about in just a second. So in the middle of the heart, right around all of these valves, we have what's called the fibrous skeleton. It is these dense connective tissue rings that are around the valves to give them more structure and make sure that it helps keep them in place. So this is called the skeleton of the heart. So the blood flows through the heart like this. All right, so it's going to go from the systemic circuit. So this is used blood coming back from the body, deoxygenated blood. So it's going to either come from the inferior vena cava or superior vena cava to the right atrium. From the right atrium, it'll go through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to squeeze, and it's going to go through the blood's going to go through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk. Then that will divide to the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. At the lungs, we're going to have the little magic of oxygen being added to the blood and carbon dioxide removed. And then from there, it's going to go to the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins go to the left atrium. Now we're back in the heart. The mitral or bicuspid valve separates that from the left ventricle, so the blood goes through that door. Once it's in the left ventricle will squeeze and it'll push the blood into the aorta, and it has to go through the aortic valve to get there. Then it goes to the systemic circuit, which ends up going through the body, dropping off that oxygen, and then when it's done, it's going to start all over again. So that's the circulation. Now the heart itself is a very hard working muscle. It's the hardest working muscle in the body. It is the James Brown, hardest working man in show business. It's the hardest working muscle in the body. It is the only muscle that's going to beat your entire life, contract your entire life, contracts before you're born, and it'll contract until you die. So it needs a lot of oxygen. And so I have a special little way to get blood to it. Now, as the blood gets pushed through the aortic semilunar valve, this aorta here, there's a lot of pressure at this point. So as soon as the blood gets pushed out, it's going to find resistance and want to try to push back into the heart. Now, the aortic semilunar valves block that off. But there's a little contraption here that's really a great design. So there's two openings of arteries just on the other side of the aortic semilunar valve. And so we have all of this pressure trying to come back in, and that helps force blood into these two arteries. And they are called coronary arteries. You have a right and left coronary artery. So right where the semilunar valve is, I've got these arteries that come off of it, so that and I'll draw a little, so as the blood comes out and it meets resistance and it tries to come back in, that means it's forced back into the heart muscle by way of these coronary arteries. All right, so this is the flow chart, so to speak. So it goes to the aorta, it pushes back, and it's going to go to the right and left coronary arteries. And basically, these are going to hug the heart. So if I drew the heart kind of like this, it's laying at its side. This is the apex or whatever. So as it comes off, it's going to come off, and the aorta is going to kind of start like right in here. So it's going to come off. One side's going to go around the heart to the right, and the other side's going around the heart to the left. And so they basically hug around the heart. Now there's going to be four arteries that come off and go down towards the apex. One right on the anterior side, and it's going to come off the left coronary artery. So I guess I messed that up a little bit. I'm going to beg forgiveness and rewrite it. It's going to go right through here. That's called the anterior interventricular artery. See, where the ventricles are, there is a little muscular wall. I forgot to label it when we were looking at the heart. Anytime there's a wall between things, it's called a septum. So this little structure is called the interventricular septum. But that little interventricular septum on the outside of the heart can kind of be seen as a groove. And so the anterior interventricular artery runs along the anterior view of where the interventricular septum is. Hope that makes sense. So this view I was trying to draw like internal, which maybe didn't help any. As it goes around, there's going to be another one that goes right along the side. This is the circumflex artery. Now the right coronary artery is going to have a marginal artery that comes off here, and then if I was to turn the heart all the way around, you would see that in the posterior part, I'll kind of draw it like a dotted line, there's a posterior interventricular artery. Now, I'm not worried about this. They're all pretty much the same. The myocardial capillaries are what they're going into. But all four of these drain back into the cardiac veins, which drain into a small tube called the coronary sinus that ends up emptying into the right atrium. So the right atrium actually is going to receive three different deoxygenated bloods. One from the superior vena cava, one from the inferior vena cava, and then the one coming in from the heart itself, and that is called the coronary sinus. So this right here on the top right, I don't know if you can read that. That's the coronary sinus. Now, it can either be seen here, or if I was to look at it really, if we went back to the cross section of the heart, you would see an opening. And again, if you can imagine, so this is the auricle right here, this little thing right here. If you could imagine if I could take that off and we were looking back at the right atrium, there's a little hole basically right in here on the right atrium. That's the coronary sinus. Now, on this picture, all I wanted to kind of show you is this is a few of the arteries. So this is the aorta, excuse me. And so right in here is where the aortic semilunar valve is. So this is going to be the right coronary artery. This one that you can kind of see on this side is the left coronary artery. Almost right when the left coronary artery starts, I have the anterior interventricular artery. If I was able to turn the heart around and look a little bit, you would see, and you can kind of see it on the one up here, right along the side wall, I have this circumflex artery. And then so now I'm looking at the right coronary artery right over here. As it goes around on the side, I'm going to have this what's called the right marginal artery. And when I turn the heart all the way around up here on the top, you can see this is the right interventricular artery. So again, not trying to throw you off on any of this, but just kind of showing you how they look.